Imagine waking up in the grand halls of a Victorian mansion. The chandeliers glitter, the carpets are thick with embroidered patterns, and the air smells faintly of polished wood and candle smoke. For a brief moment, you might think you've been transported into a fairy tale of elegance, refinement, and endless luxury. But then, the illusion shatters, because you are not the master of this house. You are not a guest, nor a family member. You are a servant, one of the countless invisible hands who made aristocratic life possible in 19th century Britain. And that, my friend, is where your nightmare begins. Victorian servants lived in a world of endless labor, suffocating rules, humiliating punishments, and social invisibility. They worked from before dawn until well past midnight, for pennies that barely kept them alive. They ate the scraps of the household, slept in cramped quarters, and endured the constant fear of being dismissed without notice. For many, being in service was less a job and more a life sentence, a grind that drained away health, dignity, and any hope of freedom. So, why wouldn't you last even a week as a Victorian servant? Well, let's step into their world. The crushing morning routine. Your day begins long before the master of the house stirs in his bedchamber. In fact, the first bell hasn't even rung, but you're already awake. It is still dark outside. The hour might be 4 o'clock in the morning. Servants were expected to rise before the family and prepare the house in silence, ensuring everything was perfect for when their employers woke. The very first task is brutal: hauling coal and lighting fires. Every room in a Victorian mansion needed warmth, and fireplaces were the heart of the home. But those fireplaces did not magically light themselves. It was your duty to clean the ashes from the previous day, polish the grate until it shone, and then carefully build a new fire. Imagine carrying heavy scuttles of coal up and down endless flights of stairs, your arms aching, your fingers blackened with soot, your lungs filling with fine dust. If you failed to light a fire properly, you would be scolded, and the household might freeze in the morning chill. Masters expected their fires roaring before they awoke. A small failure could mark you as incompetent, and incompetence was rarely forgiven. Once the fires were lit, your work continued. Floors had to be scrubbed, carpets beaten, and brass polished, until it reflected like gold. Water had to be drawn and carried, and remember, there were no taps in most homes. Buckets of water had to be fetched from pumps or wells, hauled through corridors, and distributed for washing, cooking, and cleaning. By the time the household began to stir, you were already hours into your day, sweat dripping from your brow, your muscles throbbing, your stomach empty, and this was only the beginning. The endless hierarchy of servants. One of the most brutal aspects of Victorian service wasn't just the work itself, it was the rigid hierarchy. You were constantly reminded of your place, not only by your masters but also by other servants. At the very bottom of the ladder was the scullery maid, often a young girl, sometimes only 12 or 13, who performed the dirtiest tasks. Her hands were perpetually raw from scrubbing pans in icy water. She emptied chamber pots, cleaned boots, and endured ridicule from nearly everyone above her. Above her came the kitchen maids, housemaids, and footmen. Each had slightly better tasks, but also more pressure. Housemaids spent their lives dusting, cleaning, and tending to rooms, while footmen acted as the household's showpieces. Tall, handsome, and uniformed, they were chosen for appearance as much as for ability. Yet even they were nothing more than servants. The higher ranks included the cook, often a formidable figure who ruled the kitchen with an iron fist, and the butler, who was the undisputed master of the servants' hall. Above them stood the housekeeper, overseeing all the female staff, keeping accounts, and answering only to the lady of the house. And then there was you. Wherever you landed in this pecking order, you were constantly policed by those above you, and you constantly policed those beneath you. The hierarchy was suffocating, designed to crush rebellion, ambition, and individuality. Even mealtimes reinforced this rigid system. Servants did not eat together as equals. Instead, their seating arrangements in the servants' hall mirrored the hierarchy of the household. The butler sat at the head of the table, the housekeeper beside him, and everyone else arranged in descending order of importance. To sit in the wrong place was a grave offense. For a modern person, this would be unbearable. Imagine living every moment under layers of authority, never free, never equal, never allowed to simply exist as yourself. The humiliations of invisibility. Perhaps the most psychologically brutal rule of Victorian service was the rule of invisibility. Servants were expected to make the household run flawlessly, and yet, they were not meant to be seen. When the family moved through the halls, you were expected to flatten yourself against the walls or duck out of sight. Eye contact was forbidden. Conversation was unthinkable, unless directly addressed, and even then, Your answers had to be short, deferential, and humble. Many grand houses even had secret servant passages, hidden staircases, and narrow doors designed so that staff could move unseen. You became a shadow, always present, always working, but never acknowledged. Even when you were visible, it was humiliating. Consider the life of a lady's maid, who spent her entire existence dressing and undressing her mistress, lacing her corsets, brushing her hair, and enduring endless whims. Or the footman, required to stand silently for hours at dinner parties, dressed in livery that looked impressive but reduced him to nothing more than a decorative prop. You might imagine that, at least in your free time, you could regain some dignity, but there was no true free time. Even your evenings were consumed by mending, polishing, preparing for the next day. And when you did finally collapse into bed, your quarters were often cramped, windowless, and freezing cold. Invisibility, humiliation, exhaustion. This was the rhythm of your existence, and you were expected to endure it with a smile. The brutality of kitchen life. If you thought the household was strict, you haven't yet stepped into the beating heart of the mansion, the kitchen. A Victorian kitchen was not the cozy place of recipes and warmth we might imagine. It was a roaring furnace of noise, heat, smells, and endless demands. The cook, often one of the most feared figures below stairs, ruled her domain like a monarch. Her word was law, and anyone who disobeyed faced scorn or dismissal. Her days began before dawn, planning the meals, ordering provisions, and supervising the scullery maid, kitchen maids, and sometimes even footmen pressed into service. For the lower servants, the kitchen was grueling. Ovens were massive, needing constant attention. Meat had to be turned by hand on great spits, sometimes for hours at a time, until your arms ached and your back gave out. Pots the size of barrels were hauled onto stoves, filled with boiling broth or stew, the steam making you choke. The work never ended, chopping, plucking feathers, gutting fish, grinding spices, kneading dough. And remember, refrigeration did not exist. Food had to be preserved with salt, smoking, or ice hauled from lakes in winter, meaning a constant fight against rot and vermin. Mistakes were catastrophic. Burn the family's meat roast, and you'd face fury from the cook, humiliation in the servants' hall, and possibly dismissal. Worst of all was the scullery maid's lot. She washed every filthy pan, every greasy dish, in freezing water until her hands cracked and bled. She was usually the youngest servant, sometimes barely a child, condemned to back-breaking drudgery with no hope of rising higher. Her place was the lowest of the low, a position of suffering that almost no one escaped. The kitchen was the mansion's stomach, but for the servants inside, it was more like a prison. Scrubbing, dusting, polishing, the housemaid's curse. Now let's climb out of the kitchen and into the grand halls of the house. While the cook and scullery maid sweated over stoves, housemaids faced their own endless torment. Their job, to make the entire mansion spotless every single day. Floors were scrubbed on hands and knees. Carpets were dragged outside, beaten with rods until clouds of dust rose. Furniture was polished until it gleamed. Windows, sometimes dozens upon dozens in a single house, had to be wiped clear without streaks, mind you. Staircases had to be swept, banisters rubbed down, walls dusted. It was never-ending, a cycle that began each dawn and somehow stretched until midnight. The work was done under constant threat of criticism. A speck of dust on a windowsill, a smudge on a glass, a dull patch of brass, any of these could bring harsh words from the mistress of the house. Sometimes, complaints weren't even spoken. A look of disapproval, a raised eyebrow, could wound as deeply as any insult. And the conditions were grueling. Cleaning agents were caustic, filling the air with choking fumes. Brushes and cloths tore at your skin. The repetitive motions wore your muscles down. And through it all, you were expected to move quickly, silently, invisibly. A ghost who left no trace but perfection. Worse still, housemaids often had to haul water and coal up endless stairs, fueling fires in bedrooms and bathrooms. Imagine carrying a bucket of sloshing water up 3 or 4 floors, dozens of times a day, in heavy skirts and stiff boots. By the end of the day, your body would be trembling, your legs ready to give way. This was the reality of being a housemaid. Cleaning a home so lavish that you could never enjoy it. Servants' quarters. The life of the forgotten. When your body was ready to collapse, where did you rest? Not in comfort, I can promise you that. The servants' quarters of a Victorian mansion were cramped, cold, and joyless. They were often tucked into the attic or basement out of sight of the family and guests, like rats hidden away in the shadows. Rooms were small, sometimes shared by multiple servants, with little more than a straw mattress and a thin blanket for comfort. Windows, if they existed, were tiny, leaving the air stale and damp. Privacy was non-existent. You lived, worked, and often even dressed in full view of others. Quarters were noisy, crowded, and smelled of coal, sweat, and damp laundry. A servant might hear the scuttling of rats at night or feel the cold bite of winter air seeping through the cracks in the walls. And yet, even in these miserable rooms, rules applied. You were not allowed to decorate, not allowed to bring in luxuries, not allowed to indulge in comfort. Even sleep was strictly regulated. If the mistress rang the servant's bell in the night, a system of cords and pulleys that connected bedrooms to the servants' hall, you were expected to leap from your bed and attend to her instantly, no matter the hour. Your bedroom was not a sanctuary, it was a holding pen, a place to collapse in exhaustion before the next day of torment began. The terror of servants' bells. And speaking of those bells, they were the bane of a servant's life. In a Victorian mansion, a complex system of wires and pulleys ran through the walls, connecting each room to the servants' hall. When the master or mistress pulled a cord, a bell would ring below, each labeled to indicate the room in need. At any moment of the day or night, the shrill clang of a bell could shatter your fragile rest. If you were slow to respond, you risked angering your employer. If you answered too quickly, you risked being scolded for appearing disheveled or flustered. It was a cruel paradox. You had to be invisible until you were needed, and instantly present when called. The bells symbolized everything about Victorian service. They were constant reminders that you were not your own person. You belonged to someone else. Your time, your labor, your very body existed only for their convenience. Even in your dreams, you were never free. Many servants described a kind of phantom ringing, hearing bells in their minds even when none rang, a haunting sound that followed them all their lives. It was a life of servitude made mechanical, impersonal, and inescapable, the tyranny of myth times. Finally, let us descend into the servants' hall, where the day's labor was supposed to give way to food and rest. But even here, there was no true relief. Meals were dictated by hierarchy. The butler and housekeeper sat at the head of the table, eating first and best. Senior staff followed, with junior staff like housemaids and scullery maids left with whatever scraps remained. The food itself was often leftovers from the family table. Servants ate what the masters did not want: bones stripped of most meat, broken bread, stale pies, or vegetables grown limp. If the family entertained lavishly, servants ate well. If the family was frugal, servants starved. Conversation at the table was stiff and formal. Lower servants were expected to remain silent unless spoken to. The atmosphere mirrored the rigid hierarchy above stairs, a reminder that even in the privacy of your own hall, you were never free from rules. And when the meal ended, there was no leisure. Dishes had to be cleared, plates scrubbed, silver polished. By the time the family was retiring to their drawing rooms for music, games, or reading by the fire, you were still working, shoulders aching, eyes heavy with exhaustion. There was no rest, no escape, no dignity. The punishment of silence for a Victorian servant. Silence was not golden, it was enforced. Imagine living in a house where your voice barely mattered, where you were expected to glide through rooms unnoticed, to speak only when spoken to, and to erase yourself from the world of your masters. That was the servant's daily reality. A servant never greeted a guest unless instructed. You never joined in the conversations you overheard while setting a table or serving tea. You had no right to laugh in the family's presence, no right to share an opinion, no right even to show too much personality. You were there to work, not to exist. This enforced silence created a psychological toll that was as brutal as the physical labor. You might spend 12, 14, 16 hours in motion, yet never utter more than a handful of words. Servants wrote in diaries that they sometimes forgot how their own voice sounded. Some confessed that they lost the ability to converse naturally, their speech reduced to mechanical yes, ma'am, and at once, sir. Worse still, silence was policed. Speak too freely among your fellow staff, and word could reach the butler or housekeeper. If you were overheard laughing, humming, or, heaven forbid, complaining, you could be punished. Gossip was considered one of the gravest sins. Families feared that their secrets might slip out through the lips of servants, and so, silence was demanded. It is hard for us to imagine such a life where your humanity was locked away behind a muzzle of duty. Yet for countless men and women in Victorian mansions, this was reality. The endless war on laundry. If there was one task that broke spirits and bodies alike, it was laundry. And in a Victorian household, laundry was an endless nightmare. Clothes were not tossed into a washing machine. No, each garment had to be scrubbed by hand, boiled in copper tubs, beaten with paddles, rinsed in freezing water, wrung out, and hung to dry. Starching, ironing, and folding followed, each step requiring hours of labor. Think of the sheer volume: the master's shirts, the mistress's gowns with dozens of layers, the children's endless stockings and pinafores, the servants' own uniforms, the household linens, the towels, the tablecloths, mountains upon mountains of fabric, all needing constant care. Water had to be carried, bucket after bucket after bucket. Fires had to be stoked to keep the tubs boiling. Heavy irons, heated on stoves, were pressed into service, sometimes burning the fabric, sometimes burning the hands of the laundress. The steam made it suffocating, the chemicals stung the eyes and lungs, and the labor warped the spine. Laundry was not a weekly inconvenience, it was a daily battle, and for the poor laundress or maid in charge of it, it was hell itself. Some women grew so broken by years of laundry work that their hands became permanently swollen, their knuckles bent, their backs stooped. Laundry was the invisible battlefield of the Victorian home, and in that war, the servant always lost. Fires, lamps, and the burden of light. In an age before electricity, keeping a household lit and warm was one of the most exhausting duties of a servant. Coal fires were the heart of the Victorian home, but they did not tend themselves. A servant had to carry heavy coal scuttles from the cellar, hauling them up flight after flight of stairs, day after day. Ashes had to be scooped out, grates scrubbed, fireplaces polished. Then came the relighting, arranging kindling, coaxing flame, feeding it until it roared. And all this had to be done silently, without disturbing the sleeping family. But coal was only half the battle. Lamps filled the house with light after sunset, and lamps demanded oil. Wicks had to be trimmed, glass chimneys polished until they gleamed, reservoirs filled carefully to avoid spills. A single household might have dozens of lamps, each one needing attention every single day. It was dangerous work. A dropped coal scuttle could shatter your toes. A lamp spill could set your skirt ablaze. Many Victorian servants bore scars from burns or accidents caused by the tools of their trade. And yet, failure was not an option. A cold fireplace or a darkened corridor was seen as laziness, incompetence, even insolence. A servant's job was to create warmth and light, but they themselves lived in the shadows, unacknowledged, unthanked. The cruelty of early mornings. The clock was a tyrant in a Victorian household. Servants lived by it, and it punished them without mercy. The day began long before sunrise. The scullery maid rose first, sometimes as early as 4 a.m. to begin hauling water and scrubbing pots. The cook followed shortly after, preparing breakfast. Housemaids began lighting fires and sweeping staircases while the family still slept. The butler and footman, though higher in status, were still expected to rise early to set the household in order, and the early start was only the beginning. Servants rarely finished before midnight. That meant days of 16 to 18 hours, every single day, without pause. Imagine it. Imagine your body crying out for rest, your eyes burning with exhaustion, but the bells still ringing, the coals still waiting, the boots still needing to be polished before morning. Imagine collapsing into bed for a handful of hours, only to be torn from sleep by the harsh clang of the scullery bell at 4 a.m. again. There was no weekend, no break, no holiday. Christmas Day, you worked harder, because the family hosted feasts. Easter, the family entertained. Even your one so-called afternoon off each week was often swallowed by errands for the household. Fatigue was not an accident of service, it was its design. A tired servant was an obedient servant. The weight of uniforms. If you think servants at least dressed comfortably for this brutal labor, think again. The uniform was as much a shackle as any iron chain. Footmen, for example, were dressed in livery, bright coats with brass buttons, powdered wigs in earlier decades, tight breeches, and stockings. They looked magnificent, like ornaments of the household, but these uniforms were hot, restrictive, and humiliating. They reduced men to decorative figures, admired for appearance rather than humanity. Housemaids and parlourmaids wore long black dresses with starched aprons, cuffs, and caps. The clothing was heavy, making physical labor unbearable. Starched fabrics scratched the skin, boned corsets dug into ribs, and skirts caught on staircases or hearths. Yet the uniform had to remain spotless. A speck of soot or a splash of grease could earn you reprimand. Even the butler, dignified in his black coat and white gloves, carried the burden of constant formality. Servants were never allowed to appear casual, even among themselves. Their clothing reinforced their station, always presentable, always prepared, always a symbol of their master's wealth. It was not clothing, it was costume, and like actors on a stage, servants were trapped in roles they could never shed. Courtship and the shackles on love. Now let us turn to the subject of love, or rather, its absence. Because for Victorian servants, romance was almost always forbidden. Strict rules governed relationships. Many households banned servants from fraternizing altogether, fearing that gossip, scandal, or pregnancy might tarnish the family name. A housemaid caught walking with a footman could be dismissed. A scullery maid exchanging letters with a coachman might be cast out with no reference, her future ruined. Even when marriages between servants were permitted, they came at great cost. Couples were often separated into different households, forced to leave their positions. Love meant unemployment, and unemployment meant poverty. Women especially bore the brunt of this cruelty. If a maid became pregnant, she was often cast out instantly, with no support. Her child was stigmatized as illegitimate, her reputation destroyed, and so many servants lived in loneliness, watching the family above stairs marry, celebrate, and bear children, while their own hearts withered in silence. For those who dared to love, secrecy was the only refuge. Stolen glances in corridors, whispered words in the scullery, hurried meetings in the servants' quarters. A life where love was not joy, but danger. The surveillance of masters. Finally, let us remember that everything you did as a servant was watched. Masters and mistresses kept sharp eyes on their staff. Did you move too slowly when pouring tea? Did you dust thoroughly behind the curtains? Did you hesitate before obeying an order? Nothing escaped notice. Some households went further, deliberately testing their servants. A mistress might leave a coin on a mantelpiece, then check if it was moved or stolen. A master might purposely soil his boots, then scold the bootboy if they weren't polished to perfection. Servants lived in a state of constant paranoia. Any mistake could end your career, and with no safety nets, dismissal was a death sentence. Unemployment, starvation, or the workhouse awaited. It was not simply that you worked for your masters. It was that you lived under their surveillance, day and night. You were never free. The scullery maid's private hell. If there was one role that could break even the toughest spirit, it was the scullery maid. This was the lowest position in the servant hierarchy, and it came with the filthiest, most degrading labor imaginable. The scullery maid's kingdom was the scullery, a damp, airless chamber usually tucked near the kitchens. Here, she scrubbed every single dirty pot, pan, kettle, and plate used in the household. And in a wealthy Victorian home, that meant hundreds of items, each day, every day, without fail. She began work before dawn, hauling buckets of water, scouring greasy pans with sand, scrubbing soot from iron pots. She had to clean knives until they gleamed, polish copper pans until they reflected like mirrors, and scrub saucepans until every stain vanished. The work was endless, for as soon as one meal was done, preparations for the next began, and the cycle repeated. The scullery maid also cleaned vegetables, peeled potatoes, and plucked poultry, often standing for hours with aching feet in icy water. The cold gnawed at her hands, raw from lye soap and caustic cleaning powders. Many wrote of their skin cracking, bleeding, and becoming permanently red and swollen. And at the end of it all, she was at the bottom of the hierarchy. She ate last, after every other servant had been fed. Her room was often nothing more than a corner near the coal store. Even other servants looked down on her. To be a scullery maid was to live in misery. Yet for many young girls, especially orphans or daughters of the poor, it was the only chance at survival. Better the scullery than the streets, though sometimes it was hard to tell the difference. The tyranny of the housekeeper. If the scullery maid was at the bottom, the housekeeper ruled like a queen. Among the female staff, her word was law. She oversaw the entire household below stairs, controlling the maids, the kitchen, the linen, the keys to the storerooms. She carried a ring of keys at her waist, the very symbol of her power. Within her grasp lay access to food, wine, linens, and every valuable item in storage. Masters trusted her implicitly, and servants feared her. The housekeeper inspected the maid's work with ruthless eyes. Was the brass polished to a mirror shine? Were the tablecloths perfectly ironed? Was every inch of dust banished from the drawing room? A mistake could mean a scolding in front of everyone, or worse, dismissal. She also monitored the morals of the staff. Gossip, flirtation, or laziness could be reported to the mistress of the house. A strict housekeeper might even patrol the servants' quarters at night to ensure no impropriety took place. Yet the housekeeper's position was not enviable. She lived between two worlds, trusted by the family, but never one of them, respected by servants, but never loved. She dined alone at her own table, eating better food than the maids, but never joining the family upstairs. And so, while she seemed powerful, she was trapped in her own prison, forever an outsider, forever in service. The dinner service ordeal. If you think setting a dinner table is a simple matter of knives and forks, think again. For a Victorian servant, dinner service was a ritual of precision, a nightmare of etiquette where one mistake could ruin a career. The table had to be laid with mathematical accuracy, knives polished to a gleam, forks aligned perfectly, glasses placed at exact angles. The number of forks and knives depended on the courses, and wealthy families might serve 6, 8, even 12. A footman could spend hours arranging, checking, and rechecking the table, until it looked like a work of art. Then came the service itself. Footmen had to serve silently, gliding around the table like ghosts. Plates were presented from the left, wine poured from the right, napkins refolded the instant a guest stepped away. A dropped fork, a spilled drop of soup. Even the faintest clatter of china could bring humiliation, not only for the servant, but for the master, who would take it as a personal shame. Meanwhile, the kitchen below boiled with chaos. Cooks and scullery maids rushed to prepare course after course, each dish needing to be timed to perfection. Servants raced up and down staircases, balancing steaming terrines, hot roasts, delicate desserts. The guests laughed, toasted, and praised the hostess. But for the servants, dinner was war, a battle of nerves and exhaustion, where every movement mattered, and no one noticed their suffering. The boots, the shoes, and the endless polishing. If there was one job that seemed trivial yet consumed endless hours, it was the polishing of boots and shoes. Victorian men wore leather boots that scuffed easily. Women's shoes, too, required constant care. Each day, dozens of pairs had to be cleaned, brushed, and polished until they shone like new. And this was not optional. A gentleman's boots reflected his status, and his servant's diligence. The boot boy, often just a young lad, was responsible for this tedious labor. He scrubbed mud, polished leather, buffed heels, and even blackened soles with soot to disguise where his hands were permanently stained with polish, his fingernails dark, his lungs choked with dust. And then there were the accidents. Polish ruined clothes. Brushes wore down fingers. Some servants even swallowed boot polish in despair. It contained poisons like arsenic and lead. Polishing boots was the very image of servitude, an invisible task, demeaning and thankless, yet essential. The master never thought of the boy kneeling in the scullery, scrubbing away at his boots in the early dawn. He only noticed if the shine was imperfect. The life of the kitchen drudge. If the scullery was hell, the kitchen was purgatory. It was hot, loud, and suffocating, filled with steam, smoke, and shouting, and for the kitchen maid, it was unending torment. She rose before dawn to help the cook prepare meals for the family, guests, and staff alike. That meant peeling mountains of potatoes, chopping vegetables until her hands cramped, and plucking chickens until her fingers bled. She scrubbed chopping blocks, scoured copper pans, and hauled heavy trays up staircases that seemed endless. The kitchen maid worked under the cook's constant eye, and cooks were notorious for their tempers. A mistake meant a tongue lashing, a broken dish could mean dismissal. And yet, the kitchen maid never tasted the fine food she prepared. The roasts, puddings, and pies she labored over were for the family. She ate scraps, if anything, after hours of work. The kitchen was a factory, and the kitchen made its machinery. And machinery, in the Victorian mind, had no soul. The bells that ruled your life. In the Victorian household, the servant's life was dictated by bells. Every room in a wealthy house had a bell, connected by wire to the servants' quarters. When the mistress wanted tea, she rang. When the master wanted his boots, he rang. When a guest wanted anything at all, the bell rang. Servants lived in dread of the sudden, shrill clang. It could come at any moment, dawn, midnight, or in the middle of your meager meal. No task could be left undone, no call unanswered. Delay meant reprimand, and there was hierarchy even in bells. A bell from the mistress outranked one from the guest room. A bell from the master outranked all others. Servants scrambled to respond, sometimes colliding in the corridors in their haste. The bell system turned servants into machines, always on call, always alert, always running at the sound of another's demand. Their lives were not their own. They belonged to the bells, the gardeners, and the illusion of beauty. Outside the grand Victorian homes, servants toiled in the gardens, and though guests admired the roses, the lawns, and the ornamental hedges, they rarely imagined the backbreaking work that went into creating such beauty. Gardeners rose early to mow vast lawns with heavy manual scythes. They weeded, pruned, and dug in all weather, blazing sun, pouring rain, biting frost. They hauled water to keep flowers alive, and spread manure by the ton to enrich the soil. The work was endless and seasonal. Roses needed pruning in winter, planting in spring, training in summer. Lawns had to be clipped weekly, sometimes daily. Greenhouses full of exotic plants required constant heat, forcing gardeners to stoke furnaces day and night. Gardeners were often invisible, dismissed as mere laborers. Yet their work created the illusion of natural elegance that defined the Victorian ideal. A gentleman strolling through his gardens never thought of the servants sweating in the dirt behind the hedge. He saw beauty, never the suffering that produced it. The crushing weight of obedience. Perhaps the greatest burden of all was obedience. Servants were trained not only to labor, but to surrender their very will. Obey without question was the unspoken law. If the mistress demanded her tea in a particular cup, it had to be so even if the cup was already shattered. If the master wanted a carriage prepared in a storm, it was done even if the horse bolted and killed the coachman. Servants had no right to refuse, no right to protest. Obedience was expected instantly, completely, and without hesitation. To pause was insolence. To suggest another way was arrogance. This submission shaped the mind. Many servants learned to suppress thought, to silence opinion, to erase themselves entirely. They became shadows, existing only to reflect the desires of others. It was not merely the loss of freedom, it was the loss of self. The governess, a servant who wasn't one. The governess was one of the strangest figures in the Victorian household, a woman both essential and invisible, respected and despised. Her duty was to educate the children, teaching them to read, write, paint, and play piano, drilling them in French verbs, and correcting their manners with endless patience. She often had better education than the servants around her, and sometimes came from a fallen middle-class family herself. But socially, she belonged nowhere. The family did not consider her their equal. She dined alone, not with them. The servants did not accept her as one of their own. She had privileges and did not scrub floors or polish boots. She lived in a strange limbo, a ghost trapped between two worlds. Loneliness was her constant companion. She could not marry easily, for few men wanted a penniless governess. She could not make friends among servants, who often resented her. If she dared bond with her charges, she risked accusations of over-familiarity, and if she was too strict, she risked dismissal. Many governesses wrote of despair. Some turned to novels for escape, others to secret diaries. The most famous, Charlotte Brontë, transformed her own suffering into Jane Eyre, yet countless governesses endured silently, teaching children by day and weeping into their pillows by night. The governess may not have been scrubbing pots, but she bore a different kind of torment, the crushing weight of invisibility. The nursemaid and the children's world. If the governess handled lessons, the nursemaid ruled the nursery. Her job was to raise the children in body, if not in mind. At dawn, she bathed them, dressed them in layers of stiff clothing, buttoned their boots, brushed their hairs. She supervised meals, though she herself might only eat scraps afterward. She played with them in the garden, took them for walks in all weathers, and soothed their tantrums with lullabies whispered through clenched teeth. But behind the sweetness was exhaustion. Victorian nurseries were freezing in winter, stifling in summer. Children were prone to illness, scarlet fever, measles, whooping cough. The nursemaid might spend sleepless nights by a child's bedside, dabbing their brow with vinegar-soaked cloths, praying the fever would break. And though she gave her youth to these children, the children rarely remembered her. To them, she was a shadow, a background figure, a blur of hands that tied shoes and carried trays of porridge. The nursemaid sacrificed her health and her heart for children who, upon growing, would forget her name. The endless laundry and the heat of the watch-house. Imagine mountains of linen, sheets, towels, tablecloths, napkins, shirts, underclothes, dresses, with layers upon layers of fabric. Every piece had to be washed by hand. In the wash-house, steam filled the air. Scalding hot water boiled in giant copper tubs, and the floor was slick with soap and sweat. Washerwomen bent over wooden tubs, scrubbing garments with harsh lye soap until their hands bled. They wrung out heavy sheets, twisted dripping towels, and beat dirt from clothing with paddles until their arms trembled with exhaustion. After washing came drying, often on lines outdoors, even in winter, when clothes froze stiff as boards. Then came ironing. Heavy flat irons, heated on stoves, lifted and pressed for hours until arms ached and backs threatened to snap. This cycle repeated endlessly. Laundry was never done. Families with multiple outfit changes per day generated rivers of soiled fabric. and every piece had to look spotless. No stains, no scorch marks, no lingering smells of sweat or smoke. For the laundry maid, life was nothing but steam, burns, and aching muscles. She lived in the shadows of fabric mountains, buried in labor that no one ever praised. The butler, master of shadows. The butler was the crown jewel of a Victorian household, the highest-ranking male servant, dressed in black, dignified, and silent. Guests saw him as the embodiment of the family's prestige, but beneath the polished surface lay constant strain. The butler managed the wine cellar, a treasure trove of claret, port, champagne, and brandy. He ensured every bottle was dusted, every cork fresh, every glass gleaming. A mistake here could cost him dearly. Wine was wealth, and waste was unforgivable. He also directed footmen during meals, oversaw silver polishing, and coordinated household deliveries. He memorized every guest's preference, every family member's whim, and every possible emergency. Butlers had to be statues. They never smiled, never frowned, never slouched. They moved with slow dignity, speaking only when spoken to, yet always listening. If a guest whispered for more port, he must glide to the table instantly. His dignity came at a cost. He surrendered his humanity. Behind closed doors, many butlers admitted to bone-deep loneliness. They lived their lives in other people's houses, serving other people's legacies, while their own lives slipped away in silence. The ritual of cleaning silver. If you entered a Victorian dining room, you'd be dazzled by silver candelabras, platters, spoons, forks, knives, goblets. But beauty had a price. Polishing. Silver tarnishes quickly, and servants fought a daily war against it. Armed with cloth, powder, and endless patience, they rubbed each piece until it glowed like liquid moonlight. This was not simple polishing. Intricate engravings trapped grime. Ornate handles held soot from candles. Large platters weighed pounds, straining wrists as servants buffed them for hours. And heaven help the servant who scratched or dented a piece. Silver was an investment, and a ruined goblet might cost more than a servant's annual wages. The irony. Guests never thought of the labor behind the glitter. They saw elegance, refinement, aristocratic charm. Servants saw aching arms, red fingers, and hours stolen by inanimate objects. Fire and ash. The battle of the hearth. Victorian homes were heated by coal and wood fires, and it was servants who bore the burden of feeding and cleaning them. Each day began with ash. Servants crawled to hearths before dawn, scooping out piles of soot and cinders, their faces blackened, lungs choked, clothes covered in grime. Then came hauling coal. Heavy scuttles carried up endless stairs, dust coating every surface and choking every breath. Lighting the fires was an art. Too little coal, and the fire died. Too much, and smoke filled the room. A servant could spend hours coaxing flames to life, only to repeat the ritual in every room. And fires demanded constant attention. A gentleman's comfort meant servants creeping in silently to add coal, rearrange logs, and sweep up stray ashes. Always invisible, always silent. The house glowed with warmth because servants sacrificed their lungs to smoke and their backs to coal. The family enjoyed comfort. The servants bore the cost. When illness struck below stairs, disease haunted Victorian servants. Crowded quarters, poor diet, exhausting labor, all made them vulnerable. Tuberculosis, typhoid, influenza, these were constant threats. A fever might sweep through the servants' wing, striking down footmen and maids alike, yet the house itself carried on. If one servant fell ill, another took their place. If too many were sick, the healthy ones worked double, triple, until they too collapsed. Medical care was minimal. A servant might be allowed to rest in bed, but only briefly. Doctors were expensive, and few masters paid for one. More often, a sick servant was dismissed, left to fend for themselves in the streets. Illness did not stop the household, it merely swallowed lives quietly, one by one. The servants' hall, a world apart. If the dining room above stairs was a theater of elegance, the servants' hall below was a theater of survival. This was where servants gathered for their meals, though meals may be too generous a word. Leftovers from the family table trickled down, often cold. Sometimes half-eaten roast meat became bones with scraps. Fine wine became watered beer. Vegetables, once decorative garnishes for a lord's plate, were recycled into servant stews. But the hall was more than a place to eat. It was a fragile society in itself. The hierarchy of the house reproduced itself below stairs. The butler and housekeeper sat at the head of the table, commanding respect, while scullery maids and hallboys huddled at the far end, speaking only when spoken to. Gossip thrived here. Whispers about the master's temper, the mistress's spending, the children's scandals. Servants lived under rules of silence while on duty, so the hall became their one arena of speech, yet even this freedom was limited. A maid who gossiped too freely might lose her position. A footman who mocked the family could be dismissed by morning. The servants' hall was a paradox, a place of fleeting companionship, yet also a reminder of the rigid walls that hemmed them in. The hall boy, life at the bottom. If the butler sat at the peak of the servants' pyramid, the hall boy groaned under its crushing base. He was the youngest, the lowest, and the most invisible. The hall boy's tasks were endless and thankless. He polished boots until they gleamed, swept endless corridors, cleaned chamber pots, scrubbed muddy floors, fetched coal, and carried messages at a moment's notice. He rose before dawn and often fell asleep on his feet near midnight. For this he earned almost nothing, a pittance of wages, barely enough to keep shoes on his feet. He had no privacy, no room of his own, sometimes sleeping in a cupboard or on a mattress near the kitchen door. Worst of all, he bore the brunt of everyone's temper. Footmen barked at him, maids ordered him about, cooks shouted at him to run faster. He had no authority, no protection, and no one to shield him from abuse. Some hall boys escaped, rising in rank if they endured long enough. Others broke under the strain, fleeing service altogether. For those who stayed, childhood evaporated into servitude, replaced by a life where exhaustion was the only constant. The cook's domain, heat, pressure, and perfection. Step into the Victorian kitchen and you enter a world of fire, smoke, and chaos. At its heart stood the cook, ruler of the stove, commander of chaos. The cook's reputation could make or break a household's social standing. A ruined roast at a dinner party could be a scandal whispered about for weeks. Thus the cook bore a pressure almost unbearable, to create perfection every single day. Imagine preparing a 12-course dinner: soup, fish, roasts, vegetables, puddings, pies, cheese, fruit, coffee, and more. Every dish had to be ready at exactly the right moment. Too soon, and it went cold. Too late, and the family's wrath descended. The kitchen itself was an inferno. Coal rangers roared, ovens smoked, pans hissed with boiling fat, temperatures soared, sweat poured, and burns were daily injuries. Yet the food must look effortless, as though conjured from nowhere. Behind the scenes, the cook often ruled with an iron ladle. She barked orders to kitchen maids, tested sauces with a sharp tongue, and guarded recipes like state secrets. A great cook was feared as much as respected, for she alone could bring the master shame or glory. Her artistry fed the family's pride. Her suffering stayed hidden in the smoke. The lady's maid, keeper of secrets. If the cook ruled the kitchen, the lady's maid ruled her mistress's body. She dressed her, undressed her, brushed her hair, washed her linen, mended her gowns, and even managed her cosmetics. But she was more than a servant. She was a confidant, a witness, a shadow. She knew when her mistress quarreled with her husband, when she spent too much money, when she drank too much champagne at a ball. She held secrets that could shatter reputations. Yet this knowledge was double-edged. The mistress might trust her lady's maid, but she also despised her intimacy. A lady's maid stood too close, knew too much. She could never forget her place, even as she fastened priceless jewelry around her mistress's neck. For the maid herself, the position was bittersweet. She had better clothing than most servants, sometimes hand-me-downs of silks and satins. She traveled with her mistress, glimpsing worlds beyond her reach, yet she was chained to one woman's whims, her life dictated by the rise and fall of another's vanity. The lady's maid lived in luxury's shadow, never its light. The groom in the stables, horses were the engines of the Victorian age, and servants labored endlessly to keep them gleaming. The groom was master of the stables, responsible for creatures worth more than most human lives. He rose before dawn to feed water and brush the horses. Their coats had to shine, their manes braided, their hooves scrubbed. Harnesses and saddles required constant polishing, leather treated with oil, brass fittings gleaming like gold. The stables themselves demanded order, floors swept, hay stacked, stalls mucked daily. The smell of manure clung to everything. In winter, the cold gnawed at fingers. In summer, flies swarmed relentlessly. And above all, the groom must be ready to serve at a moment's notice. If the master wished to ride, the horse must be saddled instantly. If the carriage was called for, wheels must gleam and horses stand immaculate. Any injury to the animals meant fury from above. Horses were wealth, status, and transport rolled into one. For the groom, they were also chains, living beings to be cared for without rest, while his own needs went ignored. The scullery maid's war with dirt. No servant's life was harsher than the scullery maid's. She was the lowest of the low, condemned to the filth no one else would touch. Her day began before all others. She lit the kitchen fires, scrubbed the copper pots, hauled water, and cleaned greasy pans stacked higher than her head. She washed knives, forks, plates, kettles, ladles, everything that passed through the kitchen. Her hands cracked from lye soap, her back ached from endless bending, her clothes were soaked through daily. She lived in damp and darkness, sometimes sleeping in corners near the scullery itself. No one praised the scullery maid. Her existence was taken for granted, her labor invisible. Yet without her, the kitchen would collapse into chaos. She was the silent foundation of the household machine, and her reward was exhaustion, poverty, and obscurity. The scullery maid's life was a slow erasure. Her youth scrubbed away one greasy pot at a time. The butler, the silent general of the household. If the master was the king of the estate, the butler was his general. He commanded the male staff, managed the wine cellar, guarded the silver, and enforced order with a silent authority. The butler's very presence embodied discipline. He was always impeccably dressed. Black coat, polished shoes, spotless gloves. His voice was rarely raised, for he did not need to shout. A raised eyebrow, a faint frown, or the flick of a finger could send footmen scurrying. Every meal was his battlefield. He supervised the table's layout, ensured every fork gleamed, every napkin folded with military precision. During dinner he hovered discreetly, watching for the smallest sign, a wineglass nearing empty, a candle flickering too low, a guest looking impatient. The butler also guarded the household's reputation. He alone controlled the wine cellar, a fortune in bottles, each vintage recorded meticulously. He oversaw the silver plate, locking it away each night, counting every spoon. Any loss fell on his shoulders, yet this dignity was a prison. The butler lived in near constant restraint, a man who could never be off duty, never fully himself. His very identity became the household he served. Behind closed doors, many butlers confessed to a loneliness deeper than any servant below him endured. The housekeeper, the matriarch below stairs. If the butler commanded silence, the housekeeper commanded loyalty. She was the mother of the servant hall, the manager of the female staff, and the guardian of household order. She kept the keys, literally. They jingled from her belt, granting her authority over every cupboard, pantry, and linen closet. Every pound of sugar, every roll of cloth, every candle passed through her hands. She measured, counted, and inspected with relentless care. The housekeeper also held a peculiar power. She could make or break a servant's life. She hired the maids, disciplined them, praised or condemned them before the master and mistress. To fall into her bad graces was to invite misery. To win her favor meant a smoother path through service. Her days were filled with paperwork, inventories, and inspections. She examined sheets for stains, scolded for dust left in corners, calculated budgets, and negotiated with tradesmen. Yet despite her authority, she was still a servant, subject to dismissal if her mistress grew dissatisfied. Housekeepers were sometimes called Mrs. whether married or not, a mark of respect for their position. But behind the title, many carried the same burdens as the lowest maid: endless labor, thankless devotion, and the quiet knowledge that their power ended at the edge of the master's gaze. Servants and the seasons, winter's cruelty. The rhythm of a servant's life shifted with the seasons, and none was harsher than winter. Cold seeped into every stone of the great house. Fires must be lit in dozens of rooms each morning before the family stirred. Chimneys had to be swept, ashes cleared, coal hauled in endless buckets. The scullery maid's fingers went numb in freezing water. The groom's hands cracked open while tending to horses in icy stables. Clothing offered little relief. Servants had no fashionable layers of fur or velvet. Instead, they wore thin uniforms that offered scant protection from frost. Maids shivered as they scrubbed floors in unheated corridors, their breath misting before them. Even the food changed. Fresh produce vanished, replaced with salted meat, hard bread, and root vegetables stored from autumn. Illness thrived, chilblains, coughs, fevers. Yet there was no slowing of work. If the master wanted comfort, the servants must provide it, even as their own bodies suffered in silence. Winter did not just freeze the land, it froze the spirit. It reminded servants that their survival was secondary to the warmth and ease of those they served. Summer heat, sweat, and relentless labor. If winter punished servants with cold, summer punished them with fire. The kitchens became unbearable. Coal stoves blazed from dawn till night, turning the room into a furnace. Cooks and kitchen maids worked drenched in sweat, wiping their foreheads only to continue stirring boiling pots and roasting meats. Upstairs maids polished endless surfaces that gathered summer dust. Windows had to be opened, then closed again when the master complained of drafts. Linens grew damp in the heat, requiring constant laundering and pressing. Outdoors, gardeners toiled under blazing sun, trimming hedges, mowing lawns with hand-pushed machines, and hauling water for parched plants. Carriage rides were more frequent, meaning grooms and stable boys worked double. Worst of all were the grand summer parties. Entire estates were turned upside down to host elaborate picnics, garden teas, and open-air dances. Servants ran like ants to and fro, carrying trays, setting tables beneath trees, hauling ice to keep drinks cool. The family celebrated summer with leisure. Servants endured it as another season of exhaustion. Children of the house. Masters in miniature. For a servant, the children of the family could be both joy and torment. Nannies and nursemaids cared for them from infancy, feeding, bathing, and teaching manners. These women became closer to the children than their own parents, who often treated child-rearing as a servant's task. Many a Victorian child grew up knowing their nanny's voice better than their mother's. Yet children were unpredictable. Some were affectionate, clinging to servants as beloved figures. Others mirrored their parents' cruelty, treating servants as playthings or targets for mockery. A careless remark from a child could ruin a servant's reputation. "She was rude to me" might be enough to end a career. Servants endured broken toys hurled in anger, endless demands for games, and little feet tracking mud through freshly scrubbed halls. Yet they also heard the laughter, the first words, the secrets whispered at bedtime. Many servants carried the memory of these bonds long after the child grew, even as the grown adult forgot the hands that once dressed them. To serve the children was to live in a world of innocence and cruelty bound together. A reminder that power could rest even in the smallest hands. Courtship below stairs. Love in the shadows. Servants were human, with hearts that longed for connection, but love below stairs was fraught with peril. Men and women worked side by side, often in cramped quarters, enduring long hours together. Friendships blossomed, sometimes deepening into romance, yet every romance was dangerous. A servant caught in a compromising position risked dismissal, and in the unforgiving Victorian world, dismissal meant ruin. Still, affection found its way. A maid slipped a note into a footman's pocket. A hallboy lingered near the laundry to glimpse the scullery maid. Couples met in hidden corners of the garden, or whispered behind pantry doors. The house itself seemed designed to thwart them. Thin walls, constant surveillance, the unending scrutiny of higher servants. Yet even under these conditions, marriages did happen. Sometimes the master gave permission, sometimes not. Some couples left service altogether, dreaming of a life beyond the walls of duty. But for many, love was a stolen glance, a fleeting moment, a secret never spoken aloud. In a world of labor and obedience, romance was rebellion, religion, and the servant's soul. Faith was both comfort and control in the life of a Victorian servant. Sunday was the one day when servants might glimpse freedom. For most households allowed attendance at church. Yet even this was shaped by hierarchy. The family entered first, grandly seated in their pew. Servants followed, often seated at the back, a visible reminder of their place. Religion promised salvation, but it also reinforced obedience. Preachers thundered about duty, humility, and submission, reminding servants that their labor was God's will. The idea of knowing your station was preached as divine order. Yet faith also offered hope. Hymns sung in weary voices, prayers whispered over aching hands, the thought of heaven as a place where the great and small stood equal. These gave servants strength to endure. Some found rebellion in faith too. Nonconformist churches, Methodists, and revivalists sometimes spoke of equality before God, a radical notion in a world obsessed with class. For a few servants, belief became not submission, but quiet resistance. The servant's uniform, clothes that weren't their own. In the Victorian world, clothes were more than fabric. They were a uniform of identity, a costume that reminded servants they were never free. Each position had its own attire. The butler in his black tailcoat, the footmen in their liveries trimmed with brass buttons, the maids in plain dresses with crisp aprons and modest caps. The uniform was meant to erase individuality, a servant's own style, their personality, even their comfort. None of this mattered. The uniform also exposed hierarchy. A footman's livery was elaborate, echoing aristocratic fashion from decades before. This made them decorative as much as functional, human ornaments that impressed visiting guests. A maid's dress, by contrast, emphasized invisibility, dark fabric that hid stains, modest collars that suppressed femininity. The discomfort was constant: heavy wool uniforms in summer, thin cotton in winter, shoes that blistered, aprons that had to remain spotless no matter the work, and heaven forbid a maid allowed her cap to slip askew. It was treated as sloppiness, even moral failing. When servants walked into town, their clothes marked them instantly. Shopkeepers knew their place. Strangers recognized them as in service. The uniform was not only worn at work, it followed them everywhere, branding them as members of a class that was both indispensable and invisible. Food for the servants, the meals of the invisible. If the master's dining table gleamed with silver platters and fine wines, the servants' table told a very different story. Servants ate in the servants' hall, often after long hours preparing the family's feasts. By the time food reached them, it was usually cold, plain, and far less abundant. Bread, porridge, stews of cheap cuts, and leftovers from the master's table were the norm. Fresh meat was rare. The best cuts went upstairs. What remained, gristle, bones, scraps, were boiled into soups. There was hierarchy even here. The butler and housekeeper sat at the head of the servants' table, eating first and taking the best portions. Footmen, maids, and junior staff ate later, sometimes making do with what was left, yet mealtime was precious. It was one of the few moments servants shared a semblance of community. Jokes were told, complaints whispered, news exchanged. Even so, conversation was often restrained, for higher-ranking servants were listening. A careless word might find its way back to the mistress. The irony was cruel. Servants who spent their lives preparing lavish meals rarely tasted luxury themselves. They were surrounded by abundance but lived in scarcity, smelling the roasted meats, seeing the sugared desserts, and never being allowed to enjoy them. Servant gossip and the whispering network. In a world of rigid hierarchy, gossip was both survival and entertainment. Servants knew the family's secrets better than anyone. They overheard arguments through thin walls, noticed letters left unattended, and witnessed drunken confessions after dinner parties. They saw which guest lingered too long in the wrong chamber, which master drank more than he should, which lady had a temper hidden behind her smile. This knowledge was currency. Gossip flowed downstairs in murmured conversations, traded like coins. It bonded servants together, a shared network of forbidden truths. But it was also dangerous. Speak too freely, and word might rise back upstairs. A servant accused of spreading rumors could be dismissed in disgrace. Some servants learned to wield gossip skillfully. A whispered warning might protect a maid from a lecherous guest. A discreet reminder of what I know could soften the harshness of a housekeeper. Others used it as quiet rebellion, finding power in stories that undermined the family's polished image. Victorian society was obsessed with appearances. Servants, hidden in the shadows, saw through the facade, and their gossip, though silenced officially, was the true mirror of the household's soul. The night work, a house that never slept. Servants' labor did not end when the family retired. In fact, the night brought its own burdens. Hallboys were tasked with guarding the great front door, dozing lightly on benches in case someone knocked after hours. Maids rose before dawn to light fires, meaning their sleep was snatched in fragments. Footmen waited late into the night for carriages returning from society balls. Cooks prepared early breakfasts before the sun had risen. The silence of night in the great house was deceptive. Behind it, servants moved like shadows, polishing boots for the morning, ironing clothes, setting breakfast tables, preparing fires. Some slept in cramped attic rooms, barely large enough for a bed, while others curled on pallets in basements, always within reach if a bell rang. Night was also when fear crept in. Vast country houses groaned with strange noises, drafts whistled through empty corridors, and candlelight flickered eerily on old portraits. Superstitions thrived. Tales of ghostly mistresses, drowned children, or former servants who still wandered the halls. Many maids admitted to hurrying through night duties with their hearts racing. The family dreamed peacefully. The servants' world never stopped turning. Illness, injury, and no mercy. To fall ill as a servant was to court disaster. Servants worked long hours in cold, damp, and unsanitary conditions. Their hands cracked from endless scrubbing, their lungs filled with coal dust, their backs bent under ceaseless lifting. Injuries were common: burns from hot pans, crushed fingers in heavy doors, twisted ankles on slippery staircases. But rest was a luxury rarely permitted. A sick servant slowed the entire machine of the household. If one could not work, another had to shoulder double the burden. And if illness lingered, dismissal loomed. A servant dismissed for poor health had few prospects, no savings, no safety net, often no family to fall back on. Doctors were expensive, and employers rarely paid. Most servants treated illness with home remedies: vinegar for fevers, poultices for wounds, salt water for infections. Many endured sickness in silence, dragging themselves through work rather than risk losing their position. The harsh reality was that a servant's body was both tool and prison. Once it broke, society discarded them without a second thought. When servants rebelled, quiet acts of defiance, though bound by obedience, servants were not without resistance. Outright rebellion was rare. The risk of dismissal to great but subtle defiance thrived. A maid might accidentally break a dish belonging to a cruel mistress. A cook might water down the soup when wages were late. A footman might move with deliberate slowness, forcing a master to wait. There were sharper rebellions too. Some servants stole food or drink, nibbling from platters before they reached the dining room. Others snuck into drawing rooms to sit in armchairs forbidden to them, savoring the feel of luxury for a fleeting moment. Stories circulated of servants leaving their positions dramatically, vanishing in the night, running away with silver, or eloping with fellow staff. Such tales were whispered with both scandal and admiration. Rebellion, in whatever form, was a reminder that servants were not mere machines. They were human beings trapped in a system, and even the smallest act of defiance asserted a dignity otherwise denied to them. Leaving service, the end of a servant's road. Few servants grew old in the houses they served. For most, service was a chapter, often a long and difficult one that eventually ended in uncertainty. Some left to marry, often to laborers or tradesmen, hoping for a more stable family life. Others were dismissed for age or infirmity, replaced by younger, stronger hands. A lucky few saved enough to open small businesses, a shop, a pub, a boarding house, but many servants left with nothing. Years of labor had given them no pension, no savings, no security. They might return to poor villages, seek work in factories, or fall into destitution. The cruelest irony was that many had spent their youth caring for the comfort of others, only to find no one cared for them in return. Some became paupers, dependent on charity or the dreaded workhouse, institutions where discipline was harsher than any master's household. And yet, for all its hardships, some servants looked back on service with bittersweet memory. The camaraderie below stairs, the friendships forged in exhaustion, the sense of being part of something larger than oneself, these remained, long after the livery was hung up for the last time. So, after all this, do you think you'd last even a week as a Victorian servant? Imagine waking up before dawn in a freezing attic, scrubbing until your hands bled, eating scraps while the family upstairs feasted, never daring to sit down, and knowing that at any moment, if you faltered, if you grew sick, if you made one mistake, you could be cast out into the streets with nothing. It wasn't just a job, it was a life sentence of invisibility. Servants kept the grand Victorian world running, yet their names were forgotten, their faces blurred in history. They lived in the shadows, trapped in uniforms not of their choosing, working for families who never saw them as equals, only as moving parts in a machine of wealth. And that is why most of us today wouldn't last even a week in their shoes. We crave freedom, individuality, leisure, and dignity. All things servants were denied daily, but their story matters, because behind every glittering Victorian mansion was an army of men and women whose suffering made the illusion of elegance possible. They were the invisible backbone of an age that celebrated progress while hiding cruelty in plain sight. If you found this deep dive into the hidden world of Victorian servants fascinating, disturbing, or eye-opening, then make sure you hit the like button. It tells me you want more of these immersive explorations into the darker corners of history. Subscribe to Weird History Secrets so you never miss another long-form journey through the bizarre, the unsettling, and the forgotten. And don't just stop here. Check out my other videos on strange medieval punishments, forbidden rituals, and the terrifying realities of everyday life in the past. And one last thing, after hearing all this, if you had to live as a Victorian servant, what role do you think you could survive in? The cook, the maid, the butler, or would you have given up by day 2? Let me know in the comments, I'll be watching. Until next time, this was Weird History Secrets, where the past is far stranger than you ever imagined.